Fantastic.
Brilliant.
Wonderful to be here with you on this very warm Monday morning. Just to give you a bit of an introduction to myself. I don't usually sound this husky. I'm just getting over what we're all getting over, which is this pandemic. So please bear with me with my voice if possible. Just to give you a quick visual description of myself, I am a Black African Jamaican woman sat in front of an overstuffed bookcase wearing glasses and a very brightly coloured Ankara or wax print shirt, one of my favourite shirts actually. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. If you can't, please do let the production team know and I'll try and speak a bit more louder. Now, Culture 24 gave me a very brief introduction and I'll try to expand on that. I generally tend to call myself a public historian, but most of what I do is around supporting archives and museums in building digital capacity. Currently, what that looks like is I am the Who's Digital Archives UK project coordinator for an organisation called Who's Knowledge. And that is a project to support building a community of practice for liberatory archives in the UK. And I'm also an associate of the Research Centre for Transnational Art, Identity and Nation, aka TRAIN, which is based at the University of the Arts London, and my area of research there is Black digital practice. In addition, I am a trustee of Wikimedia UK, a charity that supports people who edit Wikipedia, and I am the UK lead of Creative Commons UK as well. I'm very happy to expand more on what all those things are in the question and answer. But if I can just share my screen and I shall get into the presentation. So hopefully you can all see that. Please do let me know in the chat if you can't. Right, so these are my contact details. I've introduced myself already. And the challenge that came to me was to provide you and to support a conversation around equity, diversity and inclusion when it comes to digital leadership in heritage. And I think the most important thing to say then, or initially, is to get us to think about what equity, diversity and inclusion mean. Now, this presentation is peppered with quotes from various public intellectuals, many Caribbean ones actually, and I will try to read the pertinent points of these out. And this is a quote by Sara Ahmed, who reminds us that the language of diversity can often be a way of avoiding confrontation. And it's important for us to think, when we're thinking through equity, diversity and inclusion, what are we inviting people to be included in? Oftentimes the systems themselves are the systems that are built on historic harms and also perpetuate present harms as well. Here, Caribbean historian Elsa Goveia in 1958, the period of a growing independence movement, reminds us that oftentimes the shame about the past fills the place that should be held by knowledge, and that the knowledge of the past may play its place in our liberation. So even though oftentimes the way that funding often works is EDI is project-based, it is based within a particular department, I want to encourage you to think about and expand our vocabulary when we think about wanting to address harm, to go beyond equity, diversity and inclusion, and go beyond thinking about it as project work. This is work to address systems, that have produced harm. And in order to do that, we need systematic change. So how can we think about that with a particular lens on the digital? I'm going to be encouraging you this morning to think through the lens of, in particular, catalogues and collections. And here I have a list of additional vocabulary, which hopefully you will take into account. So how do we create systems that are anti-racist, anti-oppressive, anti-sexist, that may be reparative and have a transitional justice at its core, that may have a goal of equity or liberation, where we demand accountability, transparency, and where we make demands also for justice. In the case of the Wikimedia movement, and the Wikimedia movement is the global movement that built Wikipedia, the online encyclopedia, in around 300 different languages. The way that I've included myself in that community, have identified this is that we have set knowledge equity as one of our goals for this next strategic period. And we define knowledge equity as a social movement where we focus our efforts on the knowledge and communities that have been left out of structures of power and privilege. Power and privilege and addressing, recognizing power and privilege are really at the core of doing this work, whether we're doing it programmatically or we're doing it digitally, in working with the catalogues and collections within heritage organisations. And again, I want to encourage you to expand and think, through knowledge equity. And especially if we think about power over a period of time, what does that mean? So oftentimes we hear people talking about knowledge gaps or knowledge equity, addressing these absences. But we also need to think about, how do we address silences, what doesn't get spoken about? So if race or even whiteness or class don't get spoken about in how our collections are represented online, and in turn the power inherent in those racializations and in those class distinctions. But also, how do we take into account knowledge debt as well? So I am defining knowledge debt by, if we think about these knowledge gaps as being accumulated and compounded over time, and comprising of historic, economic, socio-political and moral components, in order to move ourselves towards a more equitable and a more liberatory way that our organisations, that our heritage organisations function. We need to recognise that the issues that these organisations have been grown over time, and we need in turn time and investment in order to remedy those injustices. This is also a reminder that, like museums, digitisation is not neutral. And oftentimes these historic systems, whether it be your collections catalogue, or even whether it be the processes and the framework through which you are cataloguing or you are representing collections online, oftentimes these processes and practices are enshrined in a historic assumption that reinscribes violence. So this is a historian, Roopika Risam, who works on post-colonial archives, reminding us that the technology of colonialism is the creation of new archives. And in turn, when we digitize that, when we digitize these colonial assumptions and perspectives, and we can replace colonial there with sexist, with classist, we are in turn reinscribing this violence, and this time reinscribing them in the digital realm. The Barbadian the Barbadian writer, actually, George Lamming, who passed away earlier this year, reminds us that it's also important for us to take into account language, and that the name, a name, is an infinite source of control. So what does that mean when we think about how we represent our collections online? Is who gets to name our collections, and whose names, whose worldviews are in turn represented in the metadata about our collections. Oftentimes, in the archives world anyway, they talk about the catalogue as exerting intellectual control over the collection. And that intellectual control, obviously, is a control that has an authority from a particular worldview. So in turn, in thinking about addressing harm, how can we think about how our collections are represented online? Now, this is a quote from Arthur Torrington. At the time, the National Archives was digitising the slave registry records in 1817. The British government did a census of all of the enslaved people in the British Empire. Ancestry.com digitised these censuses. There was a number of different censuses, and they wanted to put them behind a paywall of the genealogy website Ancestry.com. And there was a long campaign from African Caribbean people in order to make sure that these slavery records are freely accessible for people who have been separated from their heritage. So Arthur Torrington, who was one of the spokespeople for that campaign, reminds us that free online access can be regarded as a form of reparations for the cruelty and injustice of the British in the era of African chattel slavery. And that also that archive records in turn were an instrument of that cruelty and injustice. And oftentimes museum collections, they're both how they were acquired and how they've been described and catalogues, are also technologies of that injustice as well. So Arthur was campaigning for open access or open licenses for archive records. In turn, there is also voices that calls for more consideration in who and what records are made open and to whom they are accessible. These are two examples of ethical frameworks being used to define ethical and data practices. So the FAIR framework and the CARE framework. The CARE framework I'll speak about first of all has been devised by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and it requires that data be able to give a collective benefit, that Indigenous communities have the authority to control that data, that there is also a responsibility for how that data is shared, and that ethics are taken into consideration when there are conversations about making that data open. And then in turn, there is also the framework, FAIR, and oftentimes CARE and framework together. CARE and FAIR. FAIR requires that data is findable, A, accessible, I, interoperable, and R, reusable. And together, these give an ethical framework. Oftentimes, this is used in the realms of open data, but I think these are really powerful frameworks for us all to be thinking about when creating the metadata that goes into our, not only our collections catalogues, but also into how we speak about the collections online, whether that be on the organisational website or in social media. And this gives you an idea of how our websites are increasingly, the organizational websites are increasingly becoming secondary and even tertiary to how people engage with our collections online. This is a bar chart showing the average views of the most popular artworks in the Metropolitan Museum of New York. It compares, in the red part of the bar chart, it compares how often that art record is accessed in their online catalogue compared to how often it's accessed on Wikipedia, on English Wikipedia, and on all the different language Wikipedias. To give you an example, arguably the most popular artwork in the Met Museum, the Japanese print, The Great Wave, has under 10,000 views on the Met's website compared to almost 50,000 views on English Wikipedia and almost 100,000 views, so tenfold, if my maths are correct, on all the different language Wikipedias. The likelihood that somebody will engage with your organization on your website is incredibly low and becoming even lower. And in turn, what we should aim to be doing is providing pathways for people who engage with our content on social media or in different places to make their way back to our catalogue or the other interpretation we provide online. Now, the way that the Met has done this is that they opened up and they released all of the photography they have for their out of copyright artworks on a very open Creative Commons license. These two charts provide you with an idea of the spectrum of openness available with Creative Commons licenses. Now, Wikipedia requires the most open of Creative Commons licenses, and Creative Commons is a digital license which gives automatic permission for other people to share, use, remix, and reinterpret digital files, whether that be text or whether that be images or whether that be video or audio. And by releasing things on a Creative Commons license, we are releasing our collections into a broader community that can support communities that are aiming and seeking to be liberatory and reparative and equitable. In contrast, we also need to think about how we share power in how decisions around open licenses are made. This is the key points from a report provided by two law academics at the University of Edinburgh, Mathilde Parvis and Andrea Wallace, who provided a response to the Savoy report, a French report into the restitution of objects in French museums that were looted from the continent of Africa. It's estimated that around 90% of African cultural heritage is in Europe, in the museums and private collections of Europe. And I think the caveats that Mathilde and Andrea give us are useful for us to think about when thinking about whether we make our collections open and whether we use open licenses for the digital elements of our collections. Oftentimes, requiring open licenses is oftentimes very one-sided, and it can continue to exert control over digital assets where the control should be with those communities of origin. It creates a double standard, very oftentimes, again, between collections that are held in Europe and collections that may be considered to be restituted to their communities of origin. Oftentimes, the digital rights aren't required, or a digital openness isn't required to European collections, but to restituted to collections it is. Communities of origin should enjoy full autonomy of devising any access strategy. And they remind us that to truly decolonise, we must carry through the treatment, or we must carry through this treatment also not only to museum objects, but also archival and digital materials. And the example of Glasgow Museum, which recently restituted some of the Benin bronzes in their collection. In addition to restituting the objects, Glasgow Museum also made sure that the digital rights went to the museum in Nigeria as well. So I've spoken very generally there, in conclusion, I've spoken very generally there around the frameworks of ethics that you can think about applying when you're thinking through power sharing and when you're thinking through strategies towards openness. And I've also encouraged you to think through the language that we use, and to also reflect on the systematic processes that are necessary to achieve the goals of equity and liberation. Thanks very much.